Welcome to Joe College Radio. I'm Miles King, joined this week by Jordan Linderman and Blake Broadhurst. How are you guys doing?
Doing great, Miles.
Glad to be here.
Blake, welcome to your pod. It's your first time. Let's tell the listeners a little about yourself. I hear you're a big-time academic commit out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Announcement for commitment expected soon.
Yes, I am. I'm a 4-star academic recruit out of Tulsa. I've narrowed
That's
it
so
down to
disrespectful. So disrespectful.
I'm just glad to be here. Got to stay humble.
You're just that
I've
kind of
narrowed
guy.
it down to my final 3 schools. We'll see where it takes me from then. I'm expecting an announcement here pretty soon, so be on the lookout for that.
And what are those final 3 schools?
It's come down to University of Arkansas, Oklahoma State University, and the University of Florida.
Wow. We are all waiting with bated breath. My joy for the holiday season hinges on this announcement coming up.
As does mine, but I assume we're rooting for different outcomes here.
The 24/7 sports crystal ball favors Florida to get them, but anything can happen. Anything can happen with these kids. All right, let's move on from the recruiting trail. Get on to the games of the week, championship weekend, and we'll start out with what was the de facto Big 12 title game. Game I was really pumped about. I was in Norman for this. Excited. It was rainy, but I didn't care. It was cold. I didn't care. And Mike Gundy and his coaching staff went out and laid an egg in this one. I have to say, the players played hard. They were doing the best they could, but the game plan eventually doomed them, and they lost 38-20.
Yeah, and I mean, just looking at the stats, you can see Oklahoma State couldn't do anything to stop the rushing attack of the Sooners. Samaje Perine, he's just coming off an injury. He got injured in the middle of the season, and he hasn't really been 100%. And he came back and had a huge game. He proved to be really back at where he had been in the middle of last season. Whenever he had that huge tear, he broke the single game rushing record against Kansas. So he was really able to impose his will. Along with the offensive line that protected Baker all day, it seemed like he didn't have hardly any grass stains on his jersey at all. And he didn't have to throw the ball very much. He only had 19 attempted passes. It was just a really good team effort on the offensive side. And they put a lot of stuff together on the defensive side as well when the second half came around.
Yeah, you could see that OU was able to exploit OSU's weak defense, because they did have 629 yards of total offense, even without their top Heisman contender, D.D. Westbrook, in for most of the game. But they, as you said, their offensive line dominated, as Samaje Perine had 37 carries for 240 yards. So it was very hard for OSU's defense to stop him.
Yeah, it was, and really the game started out as just as the best I could have hoped for, really. OSU forced punts on OU's first 3 possessions, and you felt that, maybe the defense is not going to be able to hold up over the entire course of the game. Reminded me of the Texas Tech game a few weeks ago, where OSU got stops on the first few possessions, and you just knew that the offense was going to go off at some point, and you felt like the Cowboys needed to get a lead before that happened, be up by 14, 17, 21 points, and they shut down the running attack in the first quarter. For the first half, for most of the time, and all they had to show for it at the end of the first quarter was a 3-0 lead. So the offense couldn't capitalize. In the second quarter, up 17-10, took the lead with 1:30 to go, and then the defense goes to prevent defense. OU just marches right down the field, scores, and then the call I am most upset about. Now I skipped over this, but I was a little bit upset about the field goal, deciding to go with the field goal in the first quarter at the 1. But you know what? It's a little bit defensible, but I still wouldn't have done it. But halftime, 18 seconds to go, Barry Sanders has his best return of the year by far, takes it out to the 50-yard line. 18 seconds left to go. You have 1 timeout, plenty of time to get a couple plays, get into field goal range. You've got a timeout, plenty of time, and what do the Cowboys do? They line up in the full house backfield, 2 Cowboy backs, Chris Carson. they just telegraphed that they were going to run the ball, ran it straight up the middle, and let time run out. It was the most cowardly coaching move I've seen in a long time. But it's what we've come to expect from Gundy in these games against OU. He just goes way too conservative against the Sooners, and he doesn't have any aggression to his play calling.
So whenever he continues to be so conservative in these big-time games, do you think his seat's getting a little warm? Is there any danger down the road of him losing his job if he's not able to perform against these top opponents like Oklahoma and Baylor?
Well, I'm by no means calling for his job whatsoever. Gundy is by far the best coach to ever come through Oklahoma State. Just looked, he turned a program which occasionally made it to a bowl and has him contending for Big 12 titles every year. But it is frustrating as a fan, and Boone Pickens said this before the season, that we have a great season, we get to this final weekend, and we blow it. We just don't show up for these games against the Sooners. It's just very puzzling how Gundy just never wants to take any chances. It's like he sees ghosts of Bedlam Pass. He sees Blake Bell going down the field in 2013. He sees Blake Bell scoring in 2012 to force overtime. Justin Gilbert dropping the interception. Brent Parker dropping the pass in 1988. I mean, he's been involved in more Bedlams than anybody else in history. So he definitely, I can understand why he feels like that. But if you're the head coach, you got to feel like you've got to lay it on the line at some point.
It was almost as if the Cowboys looked lost at the end of the first half. I don't know if they weren't expecting Barry Sanders Jr. to take it back to the 50. But when they lined up, it's like they didn't have a play call called. And after they ran it, the players looked absolutely lost. Like there was no plan. They did have a timeout. They could have taken a shot downfield, or like you said, even gotten range for a field goal, taking the lead into halftime and the momentum, but they didn't take advantage of the opportunity.
They had a mistake, and I believe it was on the video board at OU as well. They didn't have a timeout left, but on television and on the video board, they displayed that there was one. So that could be another conspiracy. There's another point in the game where I can't remember what point in the game it was, but it was the same as the Louisville-Clemson conspiracy, where the chains on the away side were marked incorrectly, about a yard off, and they fell short of the line to gain. So there are a lot of things that went into this loss. Definitely a lack of not of coaching experience, but just of gutsiness by the coaches in a big game, because you're going to need to make some gutsy calls if you want to beat a top team like Oklahoma.
Yeah, I've heard that from a couple places, but I don't remember them calling 3 timeouts in the game, and at the stadium and on TV, there were timeouts. I've heard that kind of thrown around there, but I haven't seen indisputable proof that was the case. I guess that's what the commentator said live, and they could have been wrong because I hadn't kept track either. But yeah, I can't say it's confirmed, but definitely some reputable sources have reported that. Yeah, even without the timeout, even if you don't have a timeout, just throw it deep, throw a 20-yard out, try to get some yards, and then in the second half, only score 3 points is just pathetic when you have one of the best deep passers in the country. And one of the best wide receiving cores in the country for throwing the deep ball, and they only threw 3 passes over 20 yards. All 3 of them were complete. Only threw 3 deep passes. It boggles my mind how we didn't go to that strategy in the second half. It seems like no adjustments were made. We just were content with running the ball and getting stuffed 3 downs in a row. Just very frustrating. We've come to expect this from Mike Gundy, that he always just rolls over in Bedlam, and I don't foresee the way he coaches in these games changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Even with the score being at what it was, there was still hope for OSU late in the game. Samaje Perine went down and he fumbled the ball with a lot of time left, and OSU had a very promising drive and ended up getting stuffed in OU's territory, and Ben Grogan did miss a very easy field goal, for him at least, and then allowed Joe Mixon to have the 79-yard touchdown run.
Very next play, Joe Mixon goes down. But and then right before that, on that drive, I think it was the first down fiasco you were referencing, Jordan, where Blake Jarwin, they gave him a first down, then upon review, bizarrely didn't give it, and then after the review, Mike Gundy sends out the punt team and then calls a timeout like he had no idea. It was just so bizarre. Like, you had 5 minutes during the review to think about it, and then you sent out the punt team and then call them back because you changed your mind. Did so many coaching mistakes. I feel bad for the players because the coaching staff just completely laid an egg in this game, and there's nothing they can do about it. Outcoached and outplayed once again by the Sooners. Let's go on to the ACC title game. This one featured the number 3 Clemson Tigers against number 23 Virginia Tech, and Clemson was hoping to win this game, cement their spot in the college football playoff, and it got a little bit hairy towards the end for the Tigers, but they escaped narrowly 42-35 off another impressive game from Deshaun Watson.
Yeah, it's looked like Clemson has been all year, where they play a number of close games. I believe this is their 5th decided by 7 or less points. They play a number of close games. It's similar to Oklahoma State, where they play to their competition. They play just about as hard as they think they need to win. And as we saw against Pittsburgh, that doesn't always get you the win. So Clemson came in and they looked to dominate in the first half. They were up 21-7, and Virginia Tech scored relatively late with about 4 minutes left in the second quarter. But Virginia Tech, they've been a pretty impressive team whenever they're playing against high-level competition. They'll lay an egg every once in a while, but this is a game that was hard to predict because you never know what team Justin Fuente is going to put on the field. And Gerard Evans proved to be their best player once again, racking up 264 yards with 2 very critical interceptions in the game. You can't do that in the championship game and expect anything good to happen. So Virginia Tech ended up falling to the Belk Bowl, which is a huge drop from where they could have been had they won the ACC championship, and they would have gone into a New Year's Six Bowl. But instead, they're stuck as the Belk Bowl invitee with an Arkansas team that didn't really compete for the SEC West title. So this is a very deflating loss for Virginia Tech, even to be that close. I'm sure it was very hard for them to swallow that, but overall a great season for Virginia Tech, and they have a chance to get a 10-win season in Fuente's first tenure as head coach.
Yeah, it was a very impressive season from Fuentes, especially coming to a big organization like this and being able to take that team to the ACC championship in a conference that's full of strong teams. He did end up falling short to Clemson, but they played a tight game. There was the crucial interception to end the game by Gerard Evans, and of course interception earlier that actually led to a touchdown by Clemson. So it's crucial turnovers like that lead to scores that makes you end up losing close games like this.
Yeah, and I've got to commend Virginia Tech for fighting it out and sticking in as long as they could, because this is a very talented Clemson Tigers squad. Like you said, Jordan, it seems like they're always adjusting to the level of their competition. Some weeks they'll play up and blow somebody out. Some weeks they'll keep it close against a team. Just very puzzling by them that they can never just go out and with all the talent they have, just blow some team out early. I'm sure Clemson fans have the same frustration as OSU fans for many games, like you said.
Yeah, they're going to have to step up their game against Ohio State if they want any chance in that game. I think, looking at these two teams right now, I would have to side with Clemson based on just the amount of talent and the schedule that they've played. They've played very similarly. Ohio State played a lot of close games, similar to Clemson, but I think the way that the talent stacks up and the position matchups favor Clemson in many ways, I think they've got a great chance to win that game, but they can't play down. They're going to have to bring their A game in that game, and if they win, they're going to get most likely Alabama, but they could get a really strong Washington team as well, depending on how that matchup shakes up. But you've got to go in with your A game into the college football playoff, and if you don't, they could end up getting snubbed in the semifinal. not even making it to the championship like they did last year.
I think Deshaun Watson definitely cemented his place in New York this year with an outstanding game. He was 23 through 34 through the air with 3 touchdowns and 288 yards. He also had an impressive day on his legs, 17 carries, 85 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So I think we'll definitely be seeing him as a Heisman finalist.
Yep, I would agree. He had a great year again. The only downside to his performance this year was all the interceptions he threw. He was very turnover prone, threw 15 picks on the year. But that was pretty much balanced out by the 37 touchdowns and the nearly 4,000 yards of passing. So I also expect him to be in New York. Don't expect him to win it, but I think you're right. I think he earned his trip to New York once again.
So Blake, do you give Watson any chance to win the Heisman Trophy?
Unfortunately, I do not see him winning the Heisman this year. Although he did lead his team to a very successful season and back to the playoffs again, and he had the numbers, I'd have to side with Miles on this and say that interceptions is a blemish on his record. Throwing 15 interceptions is unexcusable. Although he did have the touchdowns, like he said, in the yards passing, I just think there's too many good guys who are up for the award, and I just can't see them putting him over somebody else.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. I think in a season where a lot of players have played very well, there's just one man that's stood above every single other college football player. And Lamar Jackson's numbers, while he hasn't led his team to victories as often as a Heisman winner should, his numbers are just ridiculous, especially playing in a Power 5 conference. Just insane what he's been able to do. I think Lamar Jackson's going to win it despite somewhat of a collapse at the end of the season, losing to a Kentucky team that had a chance to compete for the SEC East title, but had some critical losses, one at the beginning of the year and then one at the end. And then, of course, with Kentucky beating them, with the stigma around a Kentucky football program, that's not going to help you a whole lot. But his numbers are too big to ignore. I think they excuse his losses as far as the Heisman Trophy goes, and I've got him winning the Heisman Trophy.
I would agree. I mean, a late blemish, but his statistics from early in the season and mid-season are just going to be too big for anybody to overcome in a year where there's no other dominant player like he was this year. Now let's move on to the Big Ten title game, and we thought this potentially could be in a play-in game to the playoff. Didn't turn out to be that way, but still a very exciting game. Wisconsin jumped out to a 28-7 lead in the first half, but then Penn State battled back. They went on a 31-3 run to end the game against Wisconsin, and they ended up winning the Big Ten title game 38-31 behind a fantastic performance from Trace McSorley, who threw for 384 yards, 4 touchdowns, and didn't turn the ball over once on a fumble, but no picks.
Yeah, for this being such an amazing game, what a waste. I all along have been saying the Big Ten champion should be in the playoff. And Ohio State making it is just such a waste. These are two great teams. You can excuse the 2-loss blemish over the 1-loss, not even division champion, in my opinion. I think Penn State should have gone in above Ohio State, but we'll get to that later when we get to the playoff segment. Getting back to this game, Trace McSorley is proving that he can be one of the best quarterbacks in the nation in the next couple of years. He's putting up huge numbers with not a whole lot of talent based on some sanctions that they've had in the past and the difficulty to recruit in the midst of the scandal with Jerry Sandusky. But they've been able to convince some good guys to stay, and Trace is one of them. He's proving his worth, along with Saquon Barkley, who didn't have his best game, but he still had a great impact. He was able to free up McSorley, get the passing game going because he was able to get a little bit going on the ground. But I thought the difference in the game was going to be the running backs. And I thought Saquon would have a bigger game, but Corey Clement had one of the best games of his career, similar to his game against Michigan whenever he put up against a Michigan defense a pretty good stat line. that didn't prove to be the case in this game, where the running backs didn't really make that huge of a difference since there's such a stark contrast. It looks like the edge went to the quarterback, and Penn State was able to control the game for the latter half. Like you said, 31-3 run starting in the second quarter at the end. So just a great game by Penn State. It's disappointing that they weren't able to make it. They're a very deserving team based on the argument that Danny Cannell made for USC being one of the strongest teams, like you saying that you could put them in the playoff even though they lost 3 games, but they played well of late. That would mean that Penn State should be number 2 in the country based on how they played of late. I think that's a flawed argument, but after winning 9 straight, you got to give it to Penn State. A great season. James Franklin's definitely got them trending in the right direction, and I know they're excited for the Rose Bowl. Maybe a little disappointed, but they haven't been to a Rose Bowl in a while, so I know that they're really pumped for that.
I think it's very impressive to what they did with the team they have. Because of the whole Jerry Sandusky scandalous stuff, they were not able to get the normal recruits that Penn State has gotten in their history. They're still able to take the recruits they did have to an 11-2 season and win the Big Ten championship game. A very impressive outing for them. They realized that Bart Houston wasn't getting it done through the air. Not that he had bad numbers, but he wasn't challenging them. They started to stack the box and really trying to challenge Corey Clement to run the ball harder. And I feel like their defense stepped up and their offense stepped up as well when their defense did. And so it was a very impressive outing for Penn State. And I do agree they're a great team, but it's hard due to the season with the bolstering loss to Michigan for the argument for the playoffs.
Yeah, this was a great game. Unfortunately, didn't have as big a postseason implication that we did, or we thought it would. But hats off to Penn State. James Franklin is turning them back into a powerhouse program, and I'm sure their name is going to be around the playoff conversation for a few years to come now with the way he's got them playing. Now, Friday night, we had a highly anticipated game in the Pac-12 championship, and this one did not turn out to be very exciting. Washington put a beat down on Colorado, 41-10. The Buffs kept it close in the first quarter. It was tied 7-7, but after that, Washington just pulled away, especially in the third quarter, and Colorado never really had a chance after that.
Yeah, and this is a game where the running backs really controlled the outcome of this game. In a game where Jake Browning was uncharacteristically inaccurate. He had 2 touchdowns off of 9 completions, which is a great percentage, but he also had 24 attempts. So the 2 touchdowns were great and timely, but you can't have a quarterback who's definitely been in the Heisman conversation throwing for fewer than 50%. So Myles Gaskins came on, and he carried the load for Washington. 29 carries for 159 yards. He was able to drain the clock and get them out of there with a huge victory. And not to mention this Washington defense that has shut down a Washington State offense that's one of the most high-powered offenses headed by Pirate of the Pacific, Mike Leach. But also a great quarterback in Sefulu Fau, who came back in the second half after getting hurt in the first quarter. He was also shut down. And so they really controlled in pretty much every statistical category you can find. Turnovers, it was 3-0. Colorado had 3 turnovers. First downs, Washington dominated with just a great control of the rushing attack, 22 first downs as opposed to Colorado's 9. And then, of course, time of possession with about 40 minutes. That's a huge recipe for success. And Chris Peterson's got his team primed for a potential upset against Alabama based on how they've played of late.
Yeah, Washington's defense seemed like seamless. It was very hard for Colorado to find any ball movement whatsoever. Myles Gaskin had a fantastic game. He had 29 carries for 159 yards. As you said, Browning had a very uncharacteristic game. They hardly threw the ball at all, which is very unlike Washington, what they normally do. But he did have 2 touchdown connections. But it was the turnovers that were the difference in this game. Colorado had 3 turnovers while Washington had 0. So that obviously led to the 31-point beatdown that Washington had over Colorado, which cemented their place in the college football playoffs.
Yeah, and it disappointing end to the season for Colorado, but definitely respect the rise. The rise was real and bolder this year. They went 1-8 in conference play last year. Massive turnaround, went 8-1, made it to the Pac-12 title game. And for all the Buffalo fans, they've got to be feeling better about their program and the direction they're taking. We'll see if they can bounce back in the Alamo Bowl, where they take on my Cowboys on December 29th. Should be a great game. Sefo Ufau, great quarterback. If he's coming in at healthy, should be a great duel between him and Mason Rudolph. But I was disappointed with how the game went, but Washington deservedly wins the Pac-12 title and cements their spot at the 4 seed, like you said, Blake. Now let's go on to the SEC title game, and won't talk about this for too long, but Blake, this had your Gators in it, and it did not go very well for Florida.
Yeah, it was definitely a rough game for Florida today, or on Saturday. We started out the game very strong, drove down the field right against Alabama's defense, who hadn't let up a touchdown the entire month of November, and scored a touchdown on the very first drive. So we looked promising. Our defense came and forced them on a 3-and-out right after that. But then it came down to Austin Appleby, who is a 5 or 6 year senior, and he is just doesn't look like he has any experience whatsoever in the big game. Made multiple poor decisions. Threw interception right there, which we then stopped them again, but they were in field goal range because of the interception. And then, of course, he throws a pick six. We have a blocked punt. I mean, everything that could have gone wrong in this game went wrong. We couldn't run the ball. Their defensive line was absolutely dominant. They plugged every hole. They put pressure on Appleby. We just couldn't move the ball. Jalen Hurts didn't really look that impressive, but it didn't matter because of how strong their defense and their run game was on Saturday. So it was a rough outing for Florida, and they were exploited for the team that they are.
Yeah, and Appleby, if you look at his completion percentage, you'd think, oh, he had a pretty good day. But you have to look at probably the most influential statistic in any game, and that's turnovers. It seemed like every single interception was a pass in stride to a defensive back for Alabama. They always seem like they're in perfect position for whatever you're going to throw at them. And, I mean, like Miles always says, they're just five stars backing up 5 stars at Alabama. And if you're going to win against Alabama, you're going to have to do what Florida did in the beginning and score quickly and often. But only getting that one touchdown drive in the first quarter, I think they need a little bit more than that at the beginning of the game. They had another one in the second quarter, but at that point, it's probably too late. You're going to have to get a big jump like Ole Miss did against Alabama this year if you even want a chance. And we saw Alabama come back in that game. So this Alabama team looks unstoppable. Jalen Hurts, like you said, Blake, he didn't look very impressive. He looked scared more than anything. He was throwing bubble screens to get some confidence, but other than that, it seemed like his wide receivers were making the plays, the running backs were making the plays, but he didn't have much to do with their success. It was really the defense and special teams, as it's been all along, who were able to drive the success for Alabama. And they're cruising in at 13-0 against a Washington team in the playoff that they're pretty impressive too. So we'll have to see how that goes, but this is a very deflating loss for the Gators. They've got an Iowa team now who has looked relatively impressive lately, but I think this Florida team is going to be very inspired. They're going to play inspired for their head coach, who they love. And Florida had what would have been a 10-win season pending a bowl win, but they were unable to play against Louisiana Lafayette based on Hurricane Matthew and Joe Aleva's him just not being flexible with his schedule. So it was a good season for Florida. You assume that Louisiana Lafayette win, and then if they get the bowl win, I say he did just as well as last season. It's just it looks a little bit different because they don't have that game. But I think it was a great season for McElwain. He won another SEC East championship, which is incredible. He's done amazing ever since he's gotten there. All he's got to do is find a quarterback, and he's got a great team. So a quarterback, keep recruiting the offensive line, get some young guys in there that can push people around, and this is a Florida team that can be dangerous real quick.
Do not be surprised if our offensive coordinator, Doug Nussmeier, does not have a job at the end of this season. He was a very poor play caller for us all season long. He would come into the game with scripted plays that would start out well, but his adaptation to the game was very, very poor, and we would end up trying stuff and going to trick plays when our run game wouldn't work. And maybe that would change with the quarterback because our offense did look proficient when we did have Will Grier for the 6 games last year. So if he does not have a job, do not be surprised, but they might give him another year's time due to the 4-star quarterback Jake Allen coming in from St. Thomas Aquinas and developing our 2 freshmen, Kyle Trask and Felipe Franks.
Yeah, it was definitely a disappointing performance. Florida rushed the ball for 0 yards against Alabama. And the reason it's 0 is because quarterback sacks are taken as rushes, but still, Alabama holding a team to 0 yards, very impressive. The defense had a great tune-up into this game. Following up the SEC championship, let's end with some action before we go to the playoff. In the MAC championship, there's the undefeated Western Michigan Broncos taking on the 8-4 Ohio Bobcats. And Ohio kept it close, but Western Michigan rode the boat to another victory. They finished the season at 13-0, and they clinch a berth in a New Year's Six Bowl, the Cotton Bowl.
Yeah, and Ohio looked really impressive in this game, holding an undefeated Western Michigan to a relatively low scoring margin compared to how they've played for most of the season. But this continues to show the huge divide in talent between the MAC East and the MAC West. With Ohio being the representative of the MAC East, that it's a down year for the East. Western Michigan and Toledo were fighting for the spot earlier in the season, but with the head-to-head victory for Western Michigan on the last game of the regular season, that cemented their spot in the MAC championship. But PJ Fleck's definitely on the radar for every single major program that's looking for a quick turnaround. Same for Mike McIntyre of Colorado. I talk about a quick turnaround going 1-8 in conference to 8-1. Now 8-2 if you count the championship game. But PJ Fleck's a great coach. He's got them rowing the boat, and he's got a great chance to make a big statement in the Cotton Bowl. In the last 2 seasons, the team that's been the non-Power 5 highest rated team, they've all won their bowl game, and that was Boise State and Houston. So don't count out Western Michigan. They've got a great chance. They got great players like Corey Davis, one of the best receivers in the country. He's up for the Biletnikoff. And then you've got just a great quarterback in Zach Terrell, who's able to make a difference on the field. So great season for PJ. He's got great players and a really solid chance to get a landmark win against a great team.
This game would be the definition of a tale of 2 halves. I would say Western Michigan came out firing. They did only have 6 points in the first quarter, but they were able to submit a 16-point lead going into half. But Ohio really came out in the second half ready to play. I'm curious as to what the halftime speech was, but he got them Bobcats ready. And they came back out firing in the third quarter and brought the game very close. If it was not for the last-minute interception, this game might have been a different game, and Ohio could have driven down and scored to win this game and really put a damper on Western Michigan's undefeated season.
Yeah, and the reason this game was close was because of uncharacteristic play by Zach Terrell, Western Michigan's quarterback. He only had 1 interception on the season going to this game, which is just insane. But it kind of caught up with him, and he threw 2 picks. It's very odd for him, but the whole team strength of Western Michigan was able to prevail, and they end up on top 29-23.
I would say the MVP of this game has got to go to Butch Hampton, though. Western Michigan's kicker did account for 15 of their 29 points.
It's an impressive stat.
Definitely something to take into consideration when the Heisman voting comes around.
I would hope so. I
will throw my hat in the ring for Zach Sinor, OSU punter. Send Butch and Zach to New York.
Yeah, if Butch isn't in, there's going to be rioting in the streets in Kalamazoo. There will be at least 10 people out there rioting.
All of them can join me on my march to the college football playoff headquarters. We're going to plan a march from Kalamazoo, Michigan to Arlington, Texas. And wrapping that up, let's get into the topic we've all been waiting for, gentlemen. The top 4 for the college football playoff were announced this Sunday, with Alabama coming in at 1, Clemson number 2, Ohio State number 3, and Washington number 4. pretty much the 4 teams that everybody was expecting coming in. They didn't shake it up too much. The biggest talking points were just that Penn State winning their conference and getting snubbed from the playoff with a head-to-head win over Ohio State, and also the Big 12 for the second time in 3 years getting left out of the playoff.
Yeah, and like you said, there wasn't a whole lot of movement. No team moved up more than 2 spots in the top 25. And we had a lot of questions on Twitter about this, and we mentioned it in the podcast that wasn't able to be aired based on a recording error. But Miles and I agree, and I'm not sure what your thoughts are on this, Blake. I think you alluded to maybe your school of thought earlier, but Ohio State did not deserve to be in the playoff, in our opinion. Based on the season that they've played, it wasn't just one blip on the schedule that was really the problem. It was inconsistent play throughout the entire season, playing a lot of close games, not to mention the precedent that had already been set in 2014 whenever a TCU team who's essentially identical to this Ohio State team was denied entrance into the playoff based on, in 2014, Ohio State winning their conference and then getting put into the playoff ahead of them. So this year, it seemed even more simple to me. Whenever you have a team from the conference that's the same as the one-loss team that isn't going to the conference championship, it just seemed very clear to me and to Miles that Ohio State did not deserve to be in since they couldn't even win their own division. What are your thoughts on that, Blake? Where would you change this college football playoff top 4?
I definitely see what you're coming from when I see the argument. I agree that Ohio State should have to play in their own conference championship to go to the playoffs. But in my opinion, I think the 4 best teams in college football are the 4 teams that are in the playoffs right now. I believe that although Penn State did show Ohio State's weaknesses when they beat him earlier in the season, Penn State did have the bolstering loss to Michigan. They also had the close defeat to Pittsburgh, which Pitt proved to show that they could beat some very high-quality teams because they also beat Clemson this year. But the 2 loss over the 1 loss, it's just hard for them to argue for that position. But I think this brings up the next point that we could see in the future an 8-team playoff being added to this. Because for arguments like this, I feel like in the years that we've had the playoffs, there's always an argument for an extra team that they could be in the playoffs. But I guess the counter-argument for that is that we're asking these college athletes to play a lot of games when their real goal is to get to the NFL in the end.
And another argument, something that I've always wondered, people want an 8-team playoff because they think it gives their team a better chance to get in, which in theory, statistically, yes, it does. But how do you decide an 8-team playoff? It's so hard to decide 4 teams. Whenever you get to an 8-team playoff, there are so many teams with the same record. You can look at all these teams that are 9-3, 10-3, 10-2. It's just so close. The top 16, excluding Auburn, the top 16, the most losses in there are 3. And most of those 3-loss teams are above a couple of 2-loss teams and even a 0-loss team. So I feel like the more expanded the playoff becomes, the more difficult it is to gauge what teams deserve to be in, and the greater the opportunity for high-brand teams to make it just because of the logo on their helmet.
Not so fast, my friend. See, I have a system which would ensure fair representation, include the 5 power conference champions guaranteed to get in, include the group of 5 champion, and then throw in 2 at-large bids. So you have a team like Ohio State this year, which went 11-1, didn't even win its own division. But obviously they're a great team, would still get in. But you still have Penn State, who beat Ohio State head-to-head. They'd be able to get in. It also ensures that one of the Power 5 conferences aren't left out, like it happens every year with a 4-team playoff with 5 power conferences.
And I definitely understand that point. Now that the Big 12 is creating a championship game, an actual championship game that is not necessarily a de facto one, but now it is very definite between the 2 best teams. I understand that argument, but at the same time, how do you get the 8 best teams in if you just go off conference championships? And I'm not advocating for just conference champions. Maybe what it sounds like, but I definitely want the 4 best teams in. And I believe that Penn State, since they had the head-to-head win against Ohio State and had a rough beginning of the season, I think that they are a better team than Ohio State. Maybe not the athletes. They don't have the pro scouts. But like Miles and I talked about last week, they've just performed better, and they've made it to their championship game, which isn't the end-all, be-all, but is a very influential statistic. But whenever you have, let's say, a 3-loss conference champion, let's say USC had snuck in, if Colorado had lost their game to USC, or I'm sorry, if Colorado had lost their game to Utah, USC gets in and they win the conference championship against Washington. This is a hypothetical. They're 10-3. Do they deserve to be in the playoff whenever there are maybe more 2-loss teams from the Big Ten, like a Michigan, a Penn State, and other 2-loss teams? Let's say Louisville hadn't lost against Kentucky in the non-conference. There are just too many things that could have gone wrong where there's so many teams with homogenous records. It's too difficult to gauge which team's better. And you have to analyze more data. It's going to be much more scrutinized the bigger the playoff gets. And eventually, we're just going to have a 64-team playoff like college basketball, because everyone has an argument to get in the greater the expansion is.
I don't think it'll ever go to be
well, that was
big.
that was hyperbole, of course.
Yeah,
but my point was that the more teams there are, the more arguments there are for teams to get in.
Yes, but it's college basketball and college football are different animals. Part of the reason everybody loves March Madness is because you get all the Cinderellas in, and there's not nearly as much of that in college football. Most of the time, the better team will win. But I still think moving it to 8 teams, college football is the only sport where if any other sport, if you win all your games, then you're in the title game. It doesn't make sense to have a sport where the champion is just decided by a group of people who come in with their own preconceived biases, and there's no path to get to the title game. Some teams will never have a chance.
And that's a hard thing to gauge due to strength of schedule, because in other sports it's much easier because they play more games and they're able to play a lot more out of conference, like in basketball. They have certain tournaments where you play against other strong out of conference teams where you're able to prove yourself. But it's hard in college football when you're forced to play against your conference who may not be as strong. So, for example, Western Michigan being in the MAC conference, which isn't considered a very strong conference nationally. I mean, they win all of their games. I mean, how can you count them out of the playoffs because of who they're playing? But they're beating whoever is put in front of them. So it's hard to make arguments in college football due to the amount of teams and the amount of week games that people schedule.
Yeah, I think it would be not. Realistically, I don't think they would include a group of 5 team, but I think it would be nice if they did. It would add the Cinderella upset narrative to the playoff, make it more exciting, even if they'd be matched up against the 1 seed almost every year. But still gives you the opportunity that a MAC team or a Mountain West or a Sun Belt or whoever it may be team may be able to make a run and, who knows, get a surprise national title. Because in the current system, there's no way that'll ever happen.
And I agree with the sentiment. I do want to see different teams get in the playoff. I don't want to see Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State every year. I don't want to see Michigan every year, OU every year, year in and year out, Florida State, just to name off a few teams. I do want to see other teams get in, but like Blake said, it's very difficult to gauge the quality of teams based on the schedules. Whenever you have such a weak schedule as Western Michigan had, while they did schedule 2 Big Ten teams, they played Illinois, who's just a gigantic cupcake, and then Northwestern, who was inconsistent, but they could play well. They only beat them by 1. So Western Michigan, while you do like to see the Cinderellas have a chance, I think they're correctly placed here. I don't think, like you said, Miles, I don't think the group of 5 would be included. I think there'd be quite a bit of scrutiny if that were the case. I would love to see it, just to see how that would happen. But I just feel like the more teams there are, the more variables and the more scrutiny, the tougher it gets. Just eight teams, you can make an argument for it. I don't think it could go any higher than that, but imagine these other bowl teams. There are so many companies that sponsor these bowl bids. How upset are they going to be whenever all of these great teams that could bring attention to their brand, how upset will they be if they get snatched away because of an 8-team playoff?
Well, the point of that, the 2 playoff games are also sponsored by outside things. The Fiesta Bowl is sponsored by PlayStation, and then Chick-fil-A is sponsoring the Peach Bowl. So I think that might even add more to their brand, being able to say that they do sponsor a playoff game.
But there are normally, you'll get one of those higher-ranked teams, the 6, 7, 8, 9, playing against a lower-ranked team. For example, this year you have Michigan playing against Florida State. So Michigan brings a lot of attention to that game, and you have more brands that are able to be exposed. You have USC playing against Penn State, who that's another big brand game. So I feel like whenever you have these 5 against 6, or 1 against 8, 2 against 7, 3 against 6, and 4 against 5, those 9 through 25, they won't get nearly the recognition that they normally would whenever you have the 5 facing the 9, the 10 facing the 12, the 6 facing the 11. I feel like that gives greater opportunity to more brands. I do agree those select bowl games would get more recognition themselves, but the vast majority of other bowl games would get pretty much no exposure compared to those 8 teams.
Well, you're only taking 4 teams, so that's only 2 games you're taking away. And I understand what you're saying, but I don't think the sponsor power would be. I think the TV money that ESPN and the Power 5 conferences could make would be much more appealing than any brand money that would be threatened by brands pulling away. And if I was running it, I would make an 8-team playoff, have the first 4 games played on the home field of the higher seeded team, and then have the semifinals played at a neutral site, sponsored like they currently are, like Blake alluded to, and then have the national championship game also at a neutral site.
Well, I don't know if you know about this rule, but for the number 1 team, they cannot be at a geographical disadvantage. So that's why you have Alabama playing where they played Florida last week, back in the Georgia Dome, and Washington having to travel all the way to Georgia. So Alabama already gets that home field advantage a little bit. I do like that system if that were in place, but at the same time, 8 teams just seems to be too much for my liking. Of course, the more teams, the better in theory, but it becomes more difficult to gauge for me. If they're already having trouble with 4 teams, I can't imagine what problems would arise if they expanded to 8.
Well, I would say that's why you make it your 5 conference champions, and then your group of 5, and then 2 at-large. So that way there's only arguing about 2 at-large teams. And if you didn't get in, well, you should have won your conference. You can't cry about not getting in if you didn't win your conference, because that's in the end, that's what's going to get you into the playoff. And then that way, if you had a team like Alabama go undefeated and lose in their conference title game, they would still probably get in with an at-large bid.
So you would advocate for, essentially what you're advocating for is the non-conference schedule becomes irrelevant for those teams that dominate year in and year out. Alabama could lose every non-conference game and win every SEC game and go to the championship. That would minimize the preparation and just the importance of those non-conference games, unless you're a team that's usually on the outside looking in. But if you're a perennial favorite, all you have to do is win your conference. And if you're Alabama, you know you've got a great chance to win every year. So what's going to discourage them from doing that? I'm sure they're not going to drop 4 games. I'm not suggesting that they would actually manipulate the system that critically, but they could put a lot less preparation into those games and start film study for their SEC opponents that they have later in the season.
Or even schedule just cupcake games to start the season due to them not mattering as much for them just winning the conference.
But if that's the case, you're still putting all your eggs into the I'm going to win my conference basket. And if you don't, and there's a team with say you lose an odd game, if you lose one game like Ohio State did this year, but Ohio State had a cupcake schedule where they're playing the the Little Sisters of the Poor and the Colorado School for the Blind. I don't think they get in if they didn't win their conference. And
you don't think they
the
get an
title game.
at-large bid?
I don't think they would. Not with the resume. Not if they played 3 cupcakes.
I think I would have to put Ohio State in, even if they played. I mean, they played Bowling Green, who's one of the worst teams in the MAC this year. They played Tulsa, who ended up doing well, but based on the conditions, it didn't help them for their bowl game, or not for their bowl game, for their road game. They played. Oh, those are the only. Oh, and they played OU, who ended up doing well. So they really only have one landmark victory, but there are a lot of teams that did not play strong non-conferences. Let's say Washington loses. I don't know. Well, they lost one game this year, but let's say that they don't get to the championship game. Let's say that one game knocks them out of the championship game. Based on their cupcake schedule, you wouldn't put Washington in, even though they're the 4th best team?
No, I wouldn't.
Wow.
Unless you would have to compare the resumes of other teams. And if it was Washington versus Ohio State this year, 2 teams, let's say Washington didn't win their conference, you'd have to put Ohio State in because they had wins over Tulsa and OU. Tulsa, quality group of 5 opponent, and then OU, Big Ten champion, and Ohio State came down and put a beat down on them on their home field.
I don't think I can get on board with that. I think that's too much emphasis. Now, while I think the conference championship should be heavily emphasized, I think that's too much emphasis on the conference championship. I do like that you have room for 2 at-large bids, but I don't think that's. I think there's too much emphasis, and the strength of the conferences can be there can be a huge disparity between them. So I don't know that I could get on board with that.
Blake, your thoughts?
I think with this season in particular, not using your way miles, but an 18 playoff, I think could have been successful. I think, in my opinion, there was a significant difference between the top 10 and those following them. So I don't think it would have been as difficult to select the final 8 teams, and you could include teams like Penn State and possibly OU into that conversation and allow them to play for their spot. There's arguments for Penn State especially that they should be included to let them play in the playoffs. So had it been an 8-team playoff this year, just hypothetically, I mean, they would get to play for that spot and prove that they show what they're made of. So I think that, especially this season, if Ohio State does not perform up to the standards against Clemson and Penn State wins their bowl game by a wide margin, it'll definitely be considered for an 8-team playoff. So it's not necessarily always much an easier decision, but you'll be able to include those teams who are just on the outside looking in.
So I just had an epiphany. Why not a 6-team playoff where the 1 and 2 seeds get a bye? Because it seems like in the past few years, you can really only make the case for 1 or 2 teams, and after that, everyone knows, okay, this team's worse. Why not have a bye for the 1 and 2 seeds and have the 3 and 6 and 4 and 5 go at it to play against them?
I think it's reasonable, but if we're going to expand the playoff, my number one priority, if I was in charge, would be making sure conference championships are the most heavily emphasized criteria, and that's how you get in. Because if you're just going to look beforehand and before the season and think, okay, well, Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, Washington, they'll probably be the best teams, then why not just put them in at the beginning, even if they lose a game or don't even win their conference?
Where I lose you, Miles, is that the conference championship is the end-all, be-all. There's no argument against a conference champion, no matter how poor they played throughout the year. Assuming, like I said, a doomsday scenario earlier, where you have 4 non-conference losses, or for those conferences that play 9 games in conference, 3 non-conference losses, and they went out in their conference, it could be a very weak conference and they'd be blown out. I think there does need to be some speculation on those teams, and I do encourage a heavy emphasis, like I've said all along, a very heavy emphasis on the playoff for conference champions, but I don't think I could commit to putting them in every single year no matter what. What are your thoughts on that, Blake?
I think it's definitely an interesting thought. because I do believe that conference championships should be heavily touted when it comes to decision. But for a conference, let's say like the SEC, where the East is significantly weaker than the West, that's a play-in game for the playoff for your standards, Miles. So had Florida somehow put together a win against Alabama, Florida had definitely an abysmal season. Do you think that they deserve to be in the playoffs just because they win this one game? Which then you'd have to consider that for a lot of teams who will lose to get upset by something, because this one game, if you have it all weighted on this SEC championship game or this Big 12 championship game, and a very weak team upsets the big team, so they get an automatic bid because of that.
I'll just say this, and then we can wrap this up. But I don't understand why we don't do it like this, but there's not the same criticism for the national title game or one of the playoff games. The national title game, everything's riding on that one game. If you lose, then you don't win, and if you win, then you're the national champion, even if it's an upset. By that logic, why don't we just give Alabama the title right now and say even if they lose to Washington, but it's close, we can just put Alabama in, and if Alabama still looks good, even if they lose in the title game, just give them the national title. And at the end of the day, it's all about going out and winning your games. And in the NFL, if you beat a team twice in the regular season and then lose in the playoffs, it's too bad. That's just the way it works.
Okay, I can agree with that. But I think it should also, in my opinion, the conferences should be able to decide who are the two best teams in your conference. Because I believe when it comes down to like the SEC, I don't think that Florida and Alabama are the two best teams in the conference. I think that should have been, Auburn and Alabama did play last week, but I think they were the two best teams in the SEC, that those two should be playing for the conference championship.
And Miles, to your point, and I know we're trying to wrap this up, so this can be the last point if you guys want, or if you have commentary on this, feel free. To your point about going ahead and giving Alabama the title, I don't think that the playoff or the national championship is the same thing as the SEC championship or the Big Ten championship or whatever. You're not playing to get into anything at the championship game. You've already been decided as the two best teams at that point. You have enough wins where you can do that. But like Blake said, had Florida won, and you have a 9-4 or a 10-3 Florida team that automatically gets into the playoff over an Alabama team that's dominated everyone all year, excluding Ole Miss. It's too much for me. I feel like there's too heavy of an emphasis on, like Blake said, that one game to get into the college football playoff. Now, once you're in, nothing else matters at that point. It's the 8 best teams playing each other in your scenario. But I can't put so much emphasis on that one game. Like Blake said, with the disparity in different conferences, like I said earlier, the MAC's not a Power 5 team, but the disparity in that conference, the disparity in the Big Ten, the fact that Penn State was able to make it is baffling. So I just can't put that much emphasis on a single game at the end of the season whenever there's no round robin like the Big 12. You have teams that don't play each other. And cross-division rivalries only happen once or twice in a lot of conferences' schedules. So I think that leaves a lot of holes in that argument.
Yeah, but like I said, if we're willing to put everything on a national title game, why would we not do the same for a conference title game?
Because there's more to prove. The conference title game isn't the national title. The Big 12 wasn't the national title. Those games decide the conference. But whenever, and in the Big 12, you don't have this problem because it's round robin. But in conferences that have more teams and can't play as many games in conference, you get teams that don't get to play each other that could affect who's the best team in the conference. And for the SEC and for most conferences, it's the winner of the one division against the winner of the other division. And when there's such a disparity, if an upset occurs, that you're really not getting the best team. You're getting the best team on that day, but based on the resume for the whole season, you're not getting the best team.
Well, that's what I'm saying for the national title game as well, is that if you had Alabama versus Ohio State and we all agreed that Alabama was by far the best team, why even play the game then? Because you run the risk of Ohio State upsetting them, and then you wouldn't have the real best team from the season winning the national title. That's my point with it.
Well, it's because you've narrowed it down to the two best teams in the country. The two best teams in the country is a lot different than the two best teams in a conference, or the two division winners in a conference. There's not as big of a difference, or there can't be as big of a difference in the quality of, if Alabama or whoever the top two are from our current college football playoff, whoever the top two end up being, these are all teams that are relatively equally matched. You can easily make an argument for Washington beating Alabama based on how their defense is played and the explosiveness of their offense at times this season. You can make the same case for Ohio State, winning a lot of close games, but winning against tough competition. And then Clemson, the same thing, a lot of close games, but playing some good teams. And of course, Alabama going undefeated in the SEC and playing USC at the beginning of the season and blowing them out of the water. All of these teams you can argue for, but if there's such a huge difference in contenders for a conference, I think it's hard to make that call. And there won't always be a huge disparity. I think what you're saying would work in certain circumstances, but there are definitely times where a conference champion could be a team that's worse than multiple teams in their conference.
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But I understand your point. But for me, it's all about the games. And I think just picking and choosing which teams to put on any given day just weakens the value of individual games. But thank you this week, Blake, for joining us. We've really appreciated it. Thank you, Jordan, as always, for joining me. We'll get this out sometime later this week, hopefully tomorrow on Tuesday. But I hope everybody's settled in for a great bowl season. A lot of good matchups coming up. Be on the lookout for information about our Bowl Pick'em group. We'll get that set up shortly, hopefully pretty soon within the next week, and we'll get that tweeted out there.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you again, Blake. You were awesome, especially for a first-time guest. We hope to have you back sometime. We hope you're very eager to get back on here.
Of course, I had a great time. Thank you, gentlemen, for having me. I'm always down to talk about college football, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, thank you, Blake. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time.